So I've come across this post on the new rules of context engineering for Claude 5 models. So this applies to the more advanced models like Fable 5 or Opus 5, and it's written by Tyreek, who is on the technical team on Anthropic. So it's basically the official instructions from Claude. So if you're using Claude Code on a regular basis, this is definitely worth paying attention to because he goes over exactly what's a new and correct way to prompt for these more advanced models. So he starts this article by explaining what is context engineering. So that's basically when you send a message to Claude, the prompt is only a small part of the context that it gets. Much of your context is assembled from your system prompt, skills, Claude.md files, memory, and also other sources. We call this context engineering, and it makes a big impact on the results you generate when using Claude Code or in building your own agents. And one of the most interesting things that he mentioned in this article is that they have actually removed 80% of Claude Code's system prompt for models like Claude Opus 5 and Claude Fable 5 with no measurable loss on our coding evaluations. So that means that the more advanced a model is getting, the less information that it needs in order to still perform at a high level. And in the rest of the articles, he describes what they've learned about prompting the new, more advanced models and how you can utilize it to update your own context engineering. And they also made it really easy to implement because they have put all these best practices in Claude Doctor. We can use the command /doctor in Claude Code, and it's going to help us right size our skills and also Claude.md files. So let's come into Claude Code and let's just ask Claude Code, can you concisely describe at a high level what the command /doctor does? And then we can see that /doctor command is Claude Code's built-in health check and tune-up command. At a high level, it diagnoses your installation, it audits context bloat, cleans up config and docs, and it tunes permissions. So in short, run it when Claude Code feels slow, bloated, or misconfigured, and it audits your setup and offers fixes. So let's enter this command, and then you can see that it's running the health check now, and then we are going to come back to it. So in the rest of the article, he basically just goes over what are the best practices. And one of the core things that they found is that they were over-constraining Claude Code, both through our system prompt and also in the Claude.md files and skills. They gave an example here, how it's sometimes when we give too much instructions, it kind of conflicts the system a bit. He mentions that these constraints were once needed in order to avoid the worst case scenarios. We have since found that we could delete many of them and let the model use surrounding context and judgment instead. Additionally, Claude Code now has many more tools. Claude used to rely on Claude.md as a source of memory, information, and guidance. Now we have memory, artifacts, and skills, which Claude can use to create new ways of loading and sharing context across sessions. So basically, Claude is just getting smarter and smarter, and then he comes up with the 6 new best practices. So on the left-hand side here are the old myths, what they used to do, and on the right-hand side here are the new ways and also the better and the current best practices. So for each one, he actually gives a details and also like example for each one. So for example, back then we need to give Claude rules, and now we can just let Claude use judgment. And then the second best practices is that back then we used to give Claude examples. Now the better way is to come up with better design interfaces. The number one rule for tool usage was to give Claude examples on how to use them. With our newest models, we found that giving examples actually constrains them to a certain exploration space. And they give an example here. The third one is that we used to have to put all the information up front. Now the better way is to use progressive disclosure. So progressive disclosure is basically loading the right context at the right times. And it is not just for skills. We also use it for tools. Some of our tools are deferred loading, which means the agent must search for their full definition using tool search before using them. This allows us to have more tools that don't make up context until they're needed. And the next one is instead of having to repeat yourself, we can now just provide simple tool descriptions. And then we have auto memory and also rich references. Now, I won't go through each one in details. If you want to read this article, I will link it down below, because the main purpose of this is not to understand it from the technical standpoint, but is how we can use this to better use Claude Code more efficiently and more effectively by using the / command of /doctor. So to summarize, the main point about this article is that the newer models need fewer rules. Anthropic now trusts the model to judge from context instead of hard coding rules. They also stopped giving usage examples, stopped repeating instructions, and now load extra guidance only when needed instead of stuffing everything into one file. And why this matters is that this suggests the more advanced models performs better with shorter, simpler instructions and letting the model decide rather than piling on rules. Overloading instructions can actually make the results worse. It also shows how fast the best practices change. So guidance from a year ago may now be wrong. So it's good to keep that in mind because things are always changing. These models are always getting smarter. So the best practices from a year ago may not be the best practices now. So when we come down here, he talks about how we can actually apply this into our context. Pulling this together, what does this look like when you assemble your context? So here we see that when we prompt, Claude Code is going to look at the references we provide, its own system prompt, the Claude.md files, skills, and memory. This essentially is our context. So how we can actually implement this is that in our Claude.md file, we can keep it lightweight and briefly describe what your repo is for, but spend most of the tokens on gotchas inside of code base. So in case you're wondering, the term gotchas means the non-obvious traps in your code base, the things that would surprise or trip up someone or even an AI agent reading the code for the first time, and that you can't figure out by just looking at the file structure. So that means we can avoid stating the obvious things that Claude should know by looking at your file system or your repo. And what we can also do is to use progressive disclosure for more details. For example, if you have several unique instructions on how to verify your work, create a verification skill and reference it from your Claude.md. And in terms of the skills, we can also think of skills as lightweight guides to let Claude find information when needed. Avoid making them over-constrained, except in highly important areas. For long skills, try and use progressive disclosure as much as possible. Divide it into many files and split them out. It's best when skills encode particular opinions, knowledge, or best practices that are particular to you, your team, or product. And for the references, we can add mentioned files to include them as references. References allow Claude to refer to an in-depth information about the current plan. This might be in spec files, mockups, or even entire code bases. Generally, you should prefer files that are in code, as it provides clear, high-fidelity instructions to Claude in a language it understands very well. For example, an HTML mockup of a design will generally produce better results than a description of the design or a screenshot. So the whole purpose of this is to simplify across our system prompt, skills, and Claude.md file. You may need to simplify just like we did. We wrote out a new command called Claude Doctor, which will help you do this automatically as well. And that's exactly what we just ran in Claude Code. And then, so let's go back to see the result. So here is what we have found. So in the cleanup, there are 8 unused skills and a Telegram plugin that are saved to disable. None has been used in months, and the Telegram bot received 0 messages in the scan window. This saves about 1.3k tokens of context every session. So we can go ahead to clean up everything, which is recommended. And then it's also recommending me to make auto mode my default mode. So this basically just approves the routine action instead of prompting me each one, like instead of me having to approve it each time. So we can also do that. And then let's submit the answer. So this is how you can use the command /doctor in order to simplify your sessions and also to help you run Claude Code more efficiently and more effectively. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. If you want to see more Claude Code updates and tutorials, consider subscribing as I post often about this topic, and I hope to see you in the next one.